Welcome to the 10th talk within the frame of l'exposition imaginaire, and as you know, it's a project developed through a very intense program of talks, like tonight, lectures, screenings, and l'exposition imaginaire is a project which addresses many questions, issues related to the exhibition making in the present age of advanced digitalization, and especially with the impact of on the reception of art and exhibitions in the digital present. As you know, all the talks are also live stream, so welcome to our virtual friends as well. And tonight I have the pleasure of having with us Artie Vierkant, one of the few actually artists in the list of participants to this project. And so before giving the floor to Artie, I will introduce him briefly. Artie was born in 1986 in Brainerd, Minnesota, and but he lives and works in New York. And his work deals with our contemporary relationship to objects and images, and questions how authorship, ownership, and objects themselves have changed after the transition into our present digital society. He received his MFA from the University of California in San Diego in 2012. He had shown in many spaces and private galleries like Messler and Foyer in New York, and in Paris at the New Gallery. And recently he also had a solo exhibition in Germany at the Westfälischer Kunstverein in Münster, and he's also a very prolific writer. He wrote for many publications, including October, and he recently wrote a very interesting essay called A New Product, which actually deals with and faces many issues related to virtual exhibitions, and so to issues connected to this project. Aside from that, he has 65,000 followers on Instagram, while the Kunsthalle has, I think, less than 7,000, so we have to learn some good tricks from Artie. And so I will leave the floor to you, and Artie will do a presentation about his work and recent researches, and then we will have some ping pong of questions and answers. So, Artie, welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Luca, all good?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for having me. Hello, Vienna and YouTube, and thank you, Luca, for inviting me to do this. First, before I get started, I just do want to clarify that the 65,000 Instagram followers are actually the product of a conceptual project by the artist Constant Dullart. I actually have no idea how many actual followers I have anymore, because he decided at one point to buy 100,000 followers for a huge amount of artists and curators, and it's been confusing since then. Anyway, so I wanted to start along kind of the framework of l'exposition imaginaire by speaking about an idea that I have been that I wrote about recently, which is the prototype exhibition, and then to go into some more depth about how we can kind of already look at, to some degree, works of art as prototypes in themselves, and then to talk about some of my projects before we get into questions. So just to begin, So it's often repeated truism, I would say, that in recent years the media landscape has broadly changed, and that especially digital media has changed everything. However, this is usually repeated, I'd say, without a true idea of what exactly has changed and how little the manual labor of the world has gone away. It's very easy to look at popular film, for example, filled with computer-generated imagery, and assume that that imagery is automatic or procedurally generated, when in fact this imagery can only be created by large teams of people working in what are essentially factories, tweaking minute details day in and day out in order to be fed to vast server farms or render farms. What's strange about this is that the gulf between this reality of virtual labor or immaterial labor and its outward perception gives labor like this the kind of inauspicious designation of requiring an immense effort to produce something that then appears to come out of thin air. This sentiment, I think, is pervasive, making everyone on the one hand assume that anything can be done digitally, and on the other see the products of digital labor as hollow or transient in some way. Instead, I'm interested in exploring how I think there are interesting possibilities that this conflicting situation presents, because digital labor has the potential, especially now, to supplant traditional labor with a potential working mode that doesn't rely on the same degree of material and capital expenditure as other formats. While the hardware it takes to generate and disseminate a digital image or other types of digital objects is certainly a very important expense and creates the kind of current state of the global digital divide of Western privilege. At the same time, given the tools, it's possible now for artists or some artists to experiment with a wide variety of methods for producing work without needing to commit to costly, sometimes wasteful material expenses or needing space necessarily. The kind of essential driving point that I'm getting at is that to assume that there's a utopia either in materials or in immateriality, I think is unfortunately a false proposition. And in my view, fitting for l'exposition imaginaire, actually, nothing is more indicative in this divide than in the many and varied issues with what is called virtual exhibition. I'm showing now a slide which is actually a screenshot from a website that Oliver Lyric, who I believe has a show up at Secession right now there in Vienna, which looks great, by the way. Anyway, Oliver Lyric created this list, which is called an incomplete timeline of online exhibitions and biennials, which is really interesting. Anyway, nothing, I think, is more indicative of these tensions than what we call virtual exhibition. Virtual exhibitions are things that I see as having started, I think, as a kind of escape trajectory for artists away from material production of art objects, emerging especially as online exhibitions. They've kind of happened in many forms and are or have been distributed in a variety of ways, but I think looking at a number of them, and again, I'm not a historian, I'm an artist, but looking at a number of them, I think a lot of them have displayed kind of similar intent. The first, I would say, is a kind of inversion of the conceptual artist Lawrence Weiner's take on conceptual work. So here in a virtual exhibition, the artist may construct the piece, but the piece may not be fabricated with traditional materials and must not be built in a traditional sense. And second, the kind of like second tenet looking into things shared philosophically sort of across different virtual exhibitions is that The works and the exhibitions themselves are often made to be accessible by anybody from anywhere. Even here, I am on YouTube intentionally being streamed to everyone. So the idea being a viewer doesn't have to live in a wealthy metropolis to see the work or travel to a physical location during open hours, open hours which often adhere to like traditional work hours, for example, which cuts down the amount of people who can actually even have the time and luxury to see work. So these two central and I'd say essentially political motivations have driven a lot of the rest of the decisions about how and why a virtual exhibition would manifest itself. For many such exhibitions, this meant some kind of organizational structure binding a number of, in some cases, internet-based works of software, videos, images. These are what I would categorize as online exhibitions, and they won't be the focus of the rest of this talk. So this isn't just about showing internet-based works in non-traditional senses. What I'd like to talk about is a particular strain of virtual exhibition that I think is interesting in its attempts to replicate or subvert architectural space, even as it replicates and potentially subverts the art object. This isn't one of them that I'm showing. This is just the Google Museum project, but I think it kind of is an interesting image. This type of virtual exhibition, which for clarity's sake, I'll suggest calling prototype exhibitions, consists of, here's a better example, consists of digitally rendered images of kind of relatively realistic or plausible objects positioned within kind of relatively realistic or plausible virtual space. These spaces tend to replicate architectural convention, even if only deployed as a kind of assumed neutral. One could call it virtual exhibition in a false white cube, essentially applying architecture more as an analogy or set dressing than as a central focus of the exhibition's intent. The logic behind this has always appealed to me as much as it also confuses. You stage an exhibition independent of physical space and independent of material constraints, independent of most concerns of both labor and economic need, and yet you at the same time invoke space, material, and labor in order to make the exhibition look real. At best, this could be read as a refusal of work, so making things without making things. But then at worst, the flip side of that is that you could read it as instead a capitulation to the idea that immaterial objects are only interesting insofar as their ability to be materially fabricated at some point in the future. I promised Luca I would mention Miltos. As far as I can tell, some of the earliest versions of this were done by Miltos Manitas and Andreas Angelidakis, both for Virtual Worlds in 1998 and a show called Neen World in 2002, which this is an image from, as well as Miltos's own Whitney Biennial 2002, which was a virtual exhibition that was not sanctioned by the Whitney Museum and is still, thankfully, squatting whitneybiennial.com. So looking at these provides a really interesting lens with which to view work of our contemporary moment, I think. In a certain sense, there's a kind of like datedness to the images that shows the kind of planned obsolescence and kind of deprecation that a lot of technological tools go through. But also they really point towards, they're very direct manifestations in a slightly different form than some things which came later. So rather than exploring the history of kind of every prototype exhibition that has happened so far, I'm interested in looking at three propositions brought forward in three separate prototype exhibitions that took place between 2010 and 2011, and that I think really nicely illustrate some of the issues and differences between the approaches that people can take to these virtual prototype exhibitions. By 2010, I would say it's an interesting time because at this point, digital image quality was getting better, the tools were easier, and importantly, the kind of Facebookization of the internet made it so that it was more difficult to kind of continue the illusion of the web or the internet as a kind of non-space where non-identities can create content free of any tethers imaginable. It was also a moment when I think a larger number of artists who had been engaged with work made for the internet just for dissemination had begun to kind of revisit, or for some visit for the first time, materiality and the languages of like sculpture, painting, and performance. So the first one I want to speak about is a show which happened in January of 2010 at Reference Gallery in Richmond, Virginia. Reference Gallery was a project space which is now defunct. It was actually it was a student-run artist space run by 4 undergraduate students at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. So in January 2010, Reference Gallery opened what I would call a prototype exhibition, which was a group show called Näher. The idea was, rather than ship the work to Virginia, the participating, that's not a good explanation photo, let's see. The participating artists instead edited photographs of empty gallery space, inserting Photoshop collages of various objects, whether it be images taken by the artists of their own physical work or of unrelated objects, appropriated imagery of different kinds. In the case of this image, a list of text, for example, that appears as though it's a vinyl wall decal. And inserted these, or like photoshopped these objects into the photos in order to suggest that the exhibition had in fact been fully fabricated and held. So this ends up with about 20 images from multiple different angles, including detail shots of individual of individual works in situ, portraying a modestly realistic physical space, although clearly, not very perspectively accurate. Each work also was cited in a very specific part of Reference Gallery's very real white cube gallery and remains stationary throughout the installation. So as you look at the installation views, one could see that clearly, like, each object is placed in the same place in the room every time. And instead, so visitors to the gallery, those that there were, at least, because Richmond has a very small art scene only, were greeted not by like physical manifestations of these image and object collages, not by objects themselves, but instead by, and let me use my slide here, instead by a lone projector showcasing the photoshopped material work, the images of these propositional works. In my view, this exhibition was an interesting and significant departure from online exhibitions that came before it and virtual exhibitions that came before it, partially because works in mirrors aren't really concerned with embodying non-space. They're not concerned with finding a radicalized alternative to the physical manifestation of the art object. Instead, mirrors is more aligned, I would say, with the ethos of punk. The exhibition essentially proposes that it doesn't matter if we can put objects together well. It doesn't matter if we can afford them. It barely matters that we have an actual space. Instead, Photoshop, Google image search, and a cheap digital camera are the corollary to the three chords that one needs to learn to join a punk band. And true to form, the objects are very, edited together with a blunt hand, which kind of invites an immediate understanding of them as provisional or like prototypical. Let's see. It's also interesting because let's see. These objects, which could be read as prototypes or like concept sketches, also say some really interesting things about it also has a really interesting relationship to the actual artists who were in the show. So the three artists were Ben Schumacher, who is billed on the list as Louis Schumacher, which is something he was doing at the time. At the time, he was organizing group shows on frozen rivers and in empty law offices. This is an image of some installations from a show called Florence Ice that I actually participated in, which was on a frozen river in Canada. So there was the three of us. The first was Ben Schumacher, then there was Brad Trammell, who extended the same concept into a 50-artist group show called Material Survey of Our Peers, also just took Photoshop work into a gallery space. And then interestingly, amazingly, Forrest Nash, who I believe has already or will speak as part of Exposition Imaginaire, participated, and he would go on to, or maybe had just started, Contemporary Art Daily, which is now, of course, the preeminent source for in vogue contemporary art installation news. Anyway, so the example and kind of different counterpoint to speak about is this crystal gallery. What if someone doesn't actually have a space? The luxuries afforded by reference galleries, actual gallery, already kind of set up a prediction to the proposition that mirrors is a radical or a punk gesture. The artist in mirrors, part of this show at Reference, essentially held a physical gallery space vacant for the period of an exhibition while using altered documentation photos to kind of wink at the idea that materials, transportation, or labor were cheaper, that they might have actually fabricated the works after all. So Crystal Gallery, on the other hand, it was a project that came out later in 2010, in October of 2010. It's put together by Timur Sin, who essentially he requested a number of different artists to send ideas for propositional sculptures that they would want to have created, which then Timur would render out in 3D rendering software in a kind of like fake physical space. So this is an example of them with Billy Ranekemp's sculpture. For the most part, the works in the exhibition adhere to recognizable material formats. Billy Ranekemp, seen here, used the opportunity to create a number of absurd propositional sports trophies. Harm van den Dorpel provided designs similar to work that he was actually producing at the time. And these 3D
So these, in this case, Artie, were real, physical works, but made in they are the result of the proposal then processed by him.
These were, these were never physicalized. Basically, these are all just 3D rendered in rendering software. My point was that these works by Harm van den Dorpel or like this is similar to the kind of thing that he was actually physically producing at the time. But for the most part, all of these images are totally fake, basically. But interestingly, so these like Charles Bruskowski's, for example, they appear like eminently plausible. They're these kind of like fake plastic things, or something similar to that appeared to be these kind of almost like low relief late Frank Stellas or something like that. Let's see, where was I? Anyway, so again, these are all like fully rendered out. They're shown in a white cube, a fake white cube with fluorescent lighting, even, which kind of underpins the determination that the exhibition is kind of a traditional gallery hang, while an alternative to a traditional gallery hang, while simultaneously being a traditional gallery hang and employing that same form. Here's some more images of that. Let's see. We get to here we go. Interestingly, though, two works in the show did subvert the format, defying status as propositional or prototypical objects. One was Lindsay Lawson's aptly titled, this is a different one. Let me find the right one. Here we go. This one. Whoops. One was Lindsay Lawson's aptly titled Impossible Non-Object of Desire, which is rendered as this massive room-filling gelatinous blob, something like a droplet of water suspended while falling, or kind of a enlarged glop of hair gel or something like that. Carrie Altman's piece for the show also displays a striking aesthetic similarity. This is Carrie's. It's also shown occupying kind of the breadth of a room, and it's called How to Hide Your Plasma, in parentheses, handheld icon shapeshift for liquid crystal display. It's this kind of transparent non-object that is shown across 13 separate installation views, transforming into various stages, becoming a kind of performative non-object that goes from distended sphere to puddle, sloshes apart and coats the entire room with its objectivity, before finally kind of reforming into a solid or relatively solid rectangle with rounded edges, as though being a smartphone. What's interesting about this is that I think Altman and Lawson's contributions showcase a really interesting dilemma in prototype and virtual exhibitions. So say, for example, the architecture of a gallery space is going to be invoked, and the materiality of work is going to be invoked within that virtual space. How then can one make an object that can actually successfully subvert physicality? It obviously isn't very provocative to suggest that a number of the works in the exhibition that seemed more plausible to physically craft in some way transcend materiality simply by not being made. And further, it's not necessarily so interesting to argue that no materials exist to make work, a work that would look like the render, even in the various stages. So if the goal is to subvert the whole notion of what an object is, one would need to explore conjectural materiality by developing forms that can't exist or can't exist based on our current understanding of materiality. But then we kind of run into this classic problem of trying to define something by its inverse. So in order to make something that seems like a non-object, we get object forms that are kind of visual and compositional tropes for materialities that we can't as easily comprehend, or that can literally, be objects that slip out of our fingers, or could only be explained by kind of like theoretical physics even. We get like gels and blobs. which is in fact kind of one of the reasons that prototype exhibitions could be so interesting. So while speculatively virtual exhibition could be a platform for exploring what art could look like as non-objects, on the other hand, a prototype exhibition, as in a virtual exhibition, as an extension of material reality or a proof of concept, can create a space of experimentation. Even in the press release for Crystal Gallery, Timur Sichin writes that it allows for an understanding of the artwork as, quote, a three-dimensional representation of geometric data, and questions, quote, where an artwork stops and its documentation begins. Let's see. So, to my thinking, this kind of perspective allows for an understanding of the art object as always already a prototype, a single manifestation of kind of a larger potential among many different instantiations. So rather than thinking of the object as a singular lump of material burdened with this, outdated kind of sense of aura, or the unique expression of some kind of artistic genius, we can understand the object possibly instead as a set of instructions that are readily replicable, which means that at once the individual object could potentially never be lost to time and instead kind of endlessly reproduced after its destruction or decomposition, which unfortunately then could both mean a sense of continual preservation, but also the fact that that later object would become kind of a knowing and mediated caricature of itself. We can also think of this as kind of a further manifestation of the cultural lineage of the conceptual project. I mean, even to begin the talk, I mentioned Lawrence Wiener. But while this is certainly the case, it's actually probably more realistic to understand it as part of kind of broader societal trends fashioned by the kind of knowledge/creative economy. Or put another way, if anyway the majority of societal output right now is designed, so to speak, by people who then have their assembly instructions carried out by others and still retain their authorship, we shouldn't maybe be surprised that the contemporary artist adopts the same model. More than ever, the instructions or intellectual property that undergirds art objects can consist of the actual work itself. The piece you see in a white cube or in photos taken in a white cube or digitally rendered to approximate a piece and a white cube can equally be part of the residue of the work as a whole, and the entire system can be seen as just a set of different stages of prototypes. So this doesn't just apply to works made for virtual exhibition, of course. I'm showing right now, for example, this is the kind of a bird's eye view of an exhibition that I worked on in 2014. This is the SketchUp file, and this is how it ultimately ended up. This is like an actual photo of it. Let's see. This kind of thinking can give kind of a great degree of contingency to art objects themselves, many of which are now created using, specifically industrial or commercial materials and techniques. We've already throughout the course of the 20th century seen this movement from, for example, let's say like the adoption of like hardware store paint or like car paint on the part of painters, but these still kind of pale in comparison to practices now, which often employ fabrication techniques that are so new that actually no similarly produced objects have been around long enough to even adequately judge their own kind of durability or their own sense of like being able to stand the test of time just as a material. Let's see. So, sorry, one second. Anyway, this is of course a rhetoric on object materiality that goes a bit to an extreme, but it also this kind of various and contingent objecthood, I think, allows substantial differences to some work of the past. So if a work exists first in a prototype exhibition, rendered or sketched for public exhibition only as a mediated image, and then is fabricated once, twice, 10 times, clearly it doesn't really necessarily matter which one is the real work. But the repetition and the spread of that work, both through its physical object copies and through its life as a mediated image, can create a democratizing accessibility to its form, potentially. So a work could be seen potentially in multiple locations simultaneously around the world, and those who couldn't be present in front of one of the manifestations could potentially see a mediated copy essentially the same. So the work of art as an information good then could be kind of itinerant or broadcast object. Let's see. This relationship to broadcast, or the mention of the word broadcast, kind of reinforces the second pillar of the tenets of virtual exhibition, as I mentioned before. So the notion that a work can be accessible from anyone by anywhere, and the establishment of essentially as a way of establishing a kind of alternative platform or a different method of going about the same thing. Ideally, and again, there's a great degree of class problem with this, but ideally it would allow for a more diverse range of artists from a variety of social and economic backgrounds to then communicate their work more freely. If you understand a prototype exhibition as an exhibition for broadcast, then it becomes clear that one doesn't necessarily really need to rely on expensive rendering tools like mirrors or crystal galleries, Photoshop, and 3D rendering software. Instead, there are other kind of more simpler, creative ways of going through making an ultimate exhibition. So I'm showing an image from Katya Novatskova's Sunni and Shiite. I'm not sure if, by the way that it's written, it looks like Sunni and Shiite, but obviously it's alluding to Sunni and Shiite. This was an exhibition she did in 2011 that I think provides a really interesting and important method for doing prototype exhibition. So in March 2011, Novatskova basically directed a webcam at a blank studio wall, and for the course of 1 week, arranged and rearranged a selection of found and fabricated objects. The objects weren't, strictly speaking, prototypes or virtual construction, but they get the same kind of contingency in that they only really exist for the camera, or only existing for the viewer through a form of mediation. The objects or the arrangement weren't open to the public in any capacity except through the stream. And in her artist statement for the work, Katya writes that it exists in a geographically unlocated and thus virtual space. The individual objects are also largely presented as kind of only important in their physical formal relation to the other objects within the webcam's view, which essentially renders the entire exercise to a play at flattening a group of objects into a singular work, and that singular work into a singular exhibition or experiment, and the kind of entire enterprise into a singular pictorial frame. What I think is important about this is that it manages to, this project by Katya essentially manages to approach prototype exhibition without getting overly caught up in new technologies for rendering space. After all, I mean, when we say something is rendered digitally, the word render itself can also refer to just kind of any advanced realistic method of expression. like when a skilled draftsman makes a finely rendered drawing, or a skilled musician renders a fine performance. A prototype then, or a prototype exhibition that is, carefully and bombastically sculpted 3D rendering software could potentially be less widely circulated than a drawing of a exhibition, for example. So I think that Novoscope's proposition puts forward that what matters is kind of the work itself and its method of mediation. To view the exhibition, one doesn't have to be geographically located anywhere in particular, and she can reach an audience absent of any kind of external partnership. And then further, kind of the entire conceit of the exhibition is not only to present a series of prototype object arrangements, but also to kind of display the actual act of their creation as the work. So she's consistently returning to the arrangements of objects, and over the course of the week, removing this object, adding this object, changing something. One gets a sense that then materials become contingent, the specifics of the objects are variable, and the entire type exhibition is then essentially constantly engaged with the process of constructing itself, which is better yet, like as opposed to some of the other examples we can do this right now. A lot of people really can. It appears that even for Koch, it was an experiment, not really brought as like a major work or an exhibition or anything worth kind of advertising. Just kind of an exercise in how an artist can gain a broad reach with relatively little sacrifice. And interestingly, this being 2011, this is also happening before the kind of seeming outbreak of different streaming services and kind of contemporary popular embrace of the new genre of media personality. Someone like PewDiePie, for example, whose central performance seems to actually be their own presence, which Katya is also giving here. It's also arguably one of the ways in which, it's entirely possible that art doesn't actually keep pace with the rest of culture, considering that opening up this aspect of the artist's practice, the process, the kind of studio, or if not studio, just the blank wall, and showing the prototype or working through prototypes is still very worrisome for some. It's my view that we shouldn't be so worried about showing the process, or especially the intellectual process behind thinking that it will soften the impact of the final original and dampen the kind of this effective impact of the aura. Much in the same way that we shouldn't be worried that having video work available on the internet hampers the experience of the work installed in space. So yeah, that's kind of a series of statements about a number of prototype exhibitions that happened in the past. I wanted to talk about that at the beginning, mostly because of the theme of L'Exposition Imaginaire. I thought it was very fitting, but also because I think it's an interesting with which to approach some of the projects that I've been engaged with over the last couple of years, and I'll go through elements of them rather briefly since I've gone quite long. But at the same time that these projects were happening, I started a series called Image Objects. These are works where essentially I was trying to find a way to make it. I'm producing not a virtual exhibition, not a prototype, but something that kind of lives in between, something that could actually potentially live in between these spaces that we so often think of in diametric opposition to each other, which are virtual and the actual, the material and the immaterial. And so the process itself is actually create a digital file, which is essentially the core, the seed of the work, and then that digital file is printed, rendered out as a final physical object in space that will get positioned in the gallery or hung or just put on the wall of my studio and photographed. And then every time that the work is photographed, I go into the space of the installation view itself and kind of pose an intervention into the installation view, either adding layers of abstraction, altering, or in other ways, possibly sometimes facing the work itself. With the idea that then when you see the mediated image of objects, you're also receiving the primary experience of the work. So rather than thinking, oh, the primary viewing experience is going to the space and seeing a specific object and kind of, being there to view its unique aura or something like that. Instead, one can also potentially have an experience with the not quite so precious, but one can have a direct viewing experience through the installation itself. So that's one just quick take on a project. I think we might talk about that a little bit in a moment. But then also on a similar, a couple of years after introducing the image objects, I started work on a series called Exploits, where kind of counter to the sort of traditional and accepted artist methodology of outright appropriation of anything imaginable. Instead, I decided to kind of take the intentionally strange opposite tack and and go.
Sorry, Artie, can you maybe put your microphone close to your mouth, because the connection is not so great.
The connection is also.
There is a bit coitus interruptus effect.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, don't worry.
Can you hear me a little better now?
Yeah. Sounds
okay,
better.
great.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just this is good anyway. I'm basically at the end. Just briefly, in this project, I go out and will license or make a negotiation with a intellectual property holder. It can be of any kind, but mostly so far I've worked with patents. And essentially, I will kind of make an agreement with them whereby I can essentially, license their intellectual property and use that kind of like virtual construct of the intellectual property itself to produce objects in the same vein. So this is, for example, an object based on a patent called detachable storage rack for a metallic structure, which is quite literally a piece of intellectual property created to protect someone's, you could call it an invention, but it's quite a rather simple concept of putting rare earth magnets in the back of shelving units and attaching that to metal of any kind as an alternate way of hanging shelves. So whereas the kind of like commercial conception of this product, the intellectual property, is created quite literally to create like storage racks or spice racks for refrigerators, the same intellectual property in a kind of open interpretation of that immaterial construct shown here can produce this other very different type of object. With that, I think I'm going to leave it there and open it up to Luca.
Okay, so thank you. And actually, you touch many issues which are worth to explore. I mean, profoundly each of them, but we don't have the time to do it. related, thinking about the prototype exhibitions you listed before. I was just thinking that, at least for me, one of the most problematic thing is that it seems that all the works in a way can be how do you say, interchangeable, where it seems that is the process, the frame, which is really like the meaningful, while basically you can replace most of the works with anything else, and it works. And so I was curious to know your opinion. In a way, you also like already say that. In fact, I think you mentioned certain works which were more effective instead of others that, in a way, they were imitating. It's funny because they're very conservative. Most of the works are very conservative. So basically, only the platform is different, but then the artistic kind of components of the works, then they are very conservative, and so it seems that you can replace everything with something else.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I think that is kind of one of the strange problems with this type of exhibition making, because I think especially as interestingly, I think oftentimes when people do this, even though it has a history going back to, as I said, at least 2000 or 2002, these prototype exhibitions. I think often when they're done, it's entirely possible that the artists kind of feel like they are either discovering it themselves or doing it right for the first time, even if they do know that there's more of a history. I'm not sure if that's accurate, so I wouldn't. I don't mean that in a negative way. Actually, is what I'm trying to say. But I do think that there is a problem that arises that I think especially in the exhibition Mirrors that I mentioned. I can put an image up of that again. I think that a lot of these works in Mirrors do just kind of like relish in their own like being virtual prototypes of some kind. In that sense, I think that's not necessarily always a bad thing, because that does mean that essentially it allows, I think what's interesting is it allows artists to maybe make mistakes or like make the kind of silly formal ideas that they wouldn't otherwise want to necessarily feel so determined about that they would say, okay, I will do that, I will produce this. And in that sense, it's possible that like interesting sculptural forms could come out of things that you would assume would just be a bad idea to try, even. But I do agree in a lot of senses that often these become rather either traditional, basically, or how to put it, or only interesting insofar as the exhibition structure that they are presented within. That somehow the exhibition structure becomes enough for them, and then it like as though that conceptually takes the burden of being interesting or poetic or provocative off of the object, which I don't think is which I don't think needs to be true. I don't think that it's necessarily true that by its nature a prototype exhibition would have works like this that are kind of like more hollow.
What I
But
think is, in a way, potentially could be very interesting, these sort of experiments with also like the exhibition making, also especially if you think from the perspective of a collection. So I was wondering how to collect this type of works or exhibitions. And so in a way you can also see a sort of resistance to the way, I don't know, museums are conceived. So it's a bit like the discussion that in the last years arise from how to collect ephemeral art or non-object space artists. And but then, interestingly enough, most of also of the artists we're talking about, in a way, shifted to the production of material objects. So it seems like sort of one-shot experiment that really like trying to push forward and being radical on that sort of kind of proposal. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying.
I don't know if I can very easily answer the second part of your question, because I can't speak for everyone in terms of why so many of them went from doing this early on and then producing objects. I kind of have like done the same in some sense, but I mean, on one hand, I do think something that I kind of tried to touch on a little bit is that I do think I guess the one thing I would have to say to like the second part of your question is that something I tried to touch on within this presentation was the idea that this kind of working, that this kind of making can also inform and have like an interesting reciprocal relationship with object making. So for example, even the series image objects that I showed at the end, which is not trying to be prototype exhibition, it's kind of trying to be its own like weird non-located singularly thing. The work on the installation views, the work that happens within the space of mediation itself, has also started to like filter through and influence like the my work. Towards just really briefly that hit on the first part of your question. I mean, you mentioned like, the question of like how are these things. You said how are these things collected, which I think, I mean, someone should have that conversation, but I think more importantly, like how are these things preserved is a strange question, because obviously, even I'm showing an image of Katja's performance now, and if you go to ustream.com and go to that same, I mean, the webpage is still there, the whole thing is still there, but not the whole thing, the page with the performance information is still there, but there's no recording left to show the entire duration of the week. I don't know whether, and frankly, I doubt that Katja did have a full, video capture of the week. That being said, there are then, if it's the case that there is no or very little video, then that means that the 8 small JPEGs that are on her website are all that kind of remains of that performance, which I think is totally fine. I think actually that one of the things that really interests me in Katja's piece, or Katja's like exhibition, I guess you could call it, is that I mean, even if you think about like, oh, how you kind of asked, or maybe just like thought aloud the general question of how are these things which are rather immaterial, how do they get collected, like what, if a museum wanted this, what would it actually get, for example, then I think ultimately just having like the preservation of like the JPEGs is fine, and I think that actually that question is ideally hopefully not so important, because I think that at their root these things should be done or are done most interestingly when they're done as this kind of totally free and open sharing that is not meant to be commercialized, basically. I think it's much more interesting that these are just kind of like, I did this for my peer group, or I did this just to like make work that anyone could see, and to just have it out there, and to that point, I think preservation becomes interesting in terms of just then I guess it's just a matter of like preserving JPEGs or something like that and making sure that those don't get lost. But I think in terms of, it would be totally ridiculous to say, oh, we'll take this mirrors exhibition and we'll fabricate it. And people have done, I think that like, it's interesting because, people said, I'm sure, and I know that people said the same about performance art. Performance is this thing which should happen in the space and in the time, and it's not something that it is actively a non-commodifying gesture. We've found, and through the same tools that the conceptual artists found, which is basically a legal contract, which is hilarious, a way to, collect or commodify performances. So let's say, the Guggenheim or the MoMA has the exclusive right to like re-perform or re-license to perform a certain performance piece by a certain person. It's a little strange, but I mean, that's that ultimately I think just ends up to the intentions of the individual artists.
Yeah. I have, talking about the image object series, the other day you, in our email exchange, you mentioned this new project you're working on, which is in a way at the Chiasma Museum for next year. And this project, in a way, is a sort of step forward of that series, because let's say the manipulations that usually you are doing on the exhibition views or in the installation photographs, in occasion of this project, you want to apply to the physical space, if I understood well.
Yeah.
And so I think this is pretty interesting. So I was curious to know something more about that.
Sure. Do you want me to show? Here, you might lose my my image for a minute. Now I'm just huge on the screen, I think.
You're very big.
Yes. 1 second.
Bigger than life. Larger than life.
Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so, true to form, this is actually my prototype of the exhibition. And I'm really clunky at navigating SketchUp with my trackpad, so bear with me. So basically, this is a room in the Chiasma Museum that I'm starting to. None of these are the final forms. This is just like kind of a beginning of a build out. But essentially, what I'll be doing is working with not only the room and the space that is already there, but also kind of doing a build out of the space so that the walls themselves seem like a little bit provisional too, and you can kind of like walk around and experience the room as this kind of, some of it will be like perfectly finished and like nicely painted and everything, and then other parts will have like panels that are missing from the wall that you can then see through to other parts of the exhibition. Let's see. I mean, this is just still totally in progress and playing, but it's kind of getting there. So these kind of gestures, these like these manipulations that happen within the space, like usually within the space of the installation photograph only, will also be kind of happening within the physical exhibition space itself.
And how we are going to document the exhibition in the same way, like doing an interventions as well on the exhibition views of the of this show?
There will be some. There will be some interaction with the installation views. I haven't entirely decided the right way to do it yet. What's interesting to me about doing this is that since the physical objects that will be in this space do, will already look like these manipulations, I can, even go in and actually change what manipulations there are. So I think it will be, I don't know, they'll, like so many of them, there'll be just like different ways that the space of the installation view is kind of broken, and the ways that like the works are expressed, that's obviously not going to be there. That's just SketchUp. Anyway, so that's a little peek behind the curtain.
When will be the show?
This is in March of next year.
Okay, cool. I don't know if do we have questions from the audience? Do you have some questions? No. And
no questions. Okay.
No question at all. But we have one.
Great.
It's not really strictly a question, but let's say I have two comments on what I've seen so far. So from the image of the virtual exhibition you made on the screen, I saw in the interesting, let's say, what intrigues me the most is the Photoshop manipulate the image, that the artwork is always very artificial, but the space itself is very organic. Like the floor, you can see clearly, pattern of, hand touch or the, let's say, organic material. But then the object itself is very flat and, beautifully, aesthetically constructed. So this tension in between the virtual object and the real space is one thing that drew my attention. And second is like I have been intrigued by approach of challenging the exhibition making and also, let's say, the institutional system of preserving art. But why do you go to eventually go to a real space, physical space? Because then, to me, it's a compromise. But maybe you can tell me what your motivation, intention, what's your further thought?
I think that honestly, for me, the intention behind, and actually kind of this goes to actually in a way this goes to the question that Luca was asking me earlier about, why do you think these people have started making objects afterwards? I think, for example, the reason that I'm so interested in working in both the spaces of mediation or image or just kind of like free sharing of a virtual exhibition, for example, as well as working with physical objects, comes down to kind of actually an embrace of that contradiction in some ways. Or, I mean, maybe it's something that seems like it would be contradictory, that, we should be like hardlined, like, oh, I will either produce objects or I will not. But on the other hand, I think that, so for example, with the image objects, what I was really interested in doing the image objects was really trying to find a way that something, could potentially have a life across both spaces, to kind of have like one foot on each side. And I understand that does seem like a contradiction or could seem compromised in some way, but I think that personally I find it like a very fertile ground, especially considering that the way that so many physical objects around us are manufactured anyway now, start in some form of digital or non-physicalized space. Actually, whether it's a like an AutoCAD rendering of like a screw or a weird piece of hardware or something like that, or whether it's like a contract, like a piece of intellectual property, or whether that's a digital recording of music, for example. And then sometimes those things stay digital, sometimes those become physicalized, and it's a kind of, I feel that that's the way that currently we are working with our own materiality, or with the materiality of the objects around us. Even, we have the entire genre of, it's kind of a good term, but it seems cheesy, which is like augmented reality. I think that kind of overlayer of, and the acknowledgement that these two worlds are not actually totally separated, they're both just kind of like different stacked layers of reality, is really important and interesting. And I think it's actually starting to show up a lot more prevalently and very interestingly in like philosophy and even like design as well. I wouldn't say that I'm not equivocating like what I'm doing with this, but I would say that, for instance, like Benjamin Bratton's book, The Stack, which just came out recently, proposes a really fascinating kind of way of looking at our like contemporary moment and these how to put it, these contradictions and like interesting scenarios that arise from our overlapping worldviews of having, like local and national like sovereignties and objects and things like that, with a complete overlayer and like many layers in a stack of different real and virtual how to put it, like actants, basically. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question or statement, but those are just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. What I'm trying to say, thank you for explanation. I don't think I entirely get it, but what I'm trying to say is like, maybe I see more potentiality in the virtual space in your approach than when it's realizing in material. So it's just what I think. So
sure.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I also have a thought comes up during the whole talk, like why there's so much interest on virtuality and internet art, and I think there's a kind of, to me, is a kind of disapproval on the reality that is out there, and but of course it's very subjective, and yeah, but I don't have more question. It's just a thought to share.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have another question, actually. Talking again about the image object series, and which are, I think, so far the work you've done, which more specifically is facing the question of the impact of the consequence of the circulation of artworks as images, and so then the clear difference between like experiencing a work physically and experiencing the same piece as an image, and I was curious if there is also, from your side, a kind of sort of criticality or resistance also to the idea of to the massive distribution of images nowadays, to the fact that more and more our knowledge is also based on this, and our, not knowledge, interpretation of things is based on that, even if on the same end, is nothing new, because art history is based on images and our knowledge has been built on that. Because I thought about, for example, Tino Sehgal, And the idea that, the fact that it doesn't allow people of taking pictures of his work, and so there are no documentation on books and magazines. And of course, your position, I think, is very different. It's very different practice. But I was wondering if there is also a sort of resistance to that, a sort of being critical to the scenario, or you don't have a sort of, I don't know, ideological position about that, but it's more you're using these issues as ingredients for your work.
I'd say that I think at any given point I have maybe multiple and overlapping positions within that entire argument. I think that, on one hand, the project is a process of, let's say, for example, I would say that I'm the opposite of Tino, where I want, if I'm doing something, I feel like it's important to me for that like mediated image to just be available. I think that, for me, ideologically, I think that like it's important for artists in general to just openly share their work. So I have the comments towards the end of when I was talking about prototype exhibition of saying, basically essentially saying like it's ridiculous for video artists to not put their videos online, for example. Because I just think, I'm in some ways I have this kind of like not hard-lined, but like in some cases, like information wants to be free kind of sentiment, especially about artworks and art objects, because I think it's just important for us to be able to figure out like what has happened. What are all these cultural contributions that people have tried to make, especially because now it's so much easier in general, but not in total, not for everybody. It's so much easier to share those things and have those accessible. It seems a little bit reactionary and kind of flawed to say like, no, this will not be available. At the same time, I realize that in essentially effacing these images or intervening within the actual pictorial space of the installation view for this specific project, it seems like, one could read that as a gesture of like retaining the aura of the object, but I would not personally like say that that's what I'm doing. What I have been trying to do with it is say, so it's important for these for people to just like be open about what they've done and show these things and share them around, but also acknowledging that so much of the cultural production of artworks happens through the dissemination of these installation views, more so than even like seeing it in person. I was interested in basically making the work immediately reflect that situation, and making it so that not only is it I want it to be clear that not only is this a work that's being shared openly, but like that you're not actually missing anything by not seeing it in person, that you're also getting...
There is no priority in a way.
Right, exactly. I'm making it so that there's no priority. So the person who, is in a studio residency in like Omaha, Nebraska or something can see, will ultimately see the same documentation images like the person who maybe saw an exhibition in New York or in Germany or wherever. And it's...
in a way is I think has been like created out of a certain kind of awareness, consciousness of a certain situation. And again, I was thinking about what happened, I don't know. It seems that is a sort of upgraded of what happened in the 60s, for example, with performance. Instead of performing and then having a documentation, when artists realize that basically the works could be only that, and then they start to perform, I don't know, for the camera, and so in a way playing with that, and not living as a kind of neutral kind of tool or device. And so I think this is pretty interesting.
I think just really, really briefly too, just to add to that, or to add to the statements that I was saying earlier, one funny change that has happened since I started this series is actually, I mean, when I started this, I don't know whether it wasn't launched yet, but at least Instagram was not a huge thing for artist community or anything. It was mostly like people on like Facebook and Tumblr and things like that. And what's become really interesting now is, so whenever I have a show of the image objects, I like photograph them and I edit them and I put them up and everything. But what's happened is now, because so many people are photographing work and putting it, on their Instagram feeds or wherever, it's actually more, you can actually see more of a realistic pictorial representation of what those physical objects look like by looking at people's photos on online in different places, which I think is kind of amazing, actually. So the kind of quote unquote realistic documentation of the work then is strangely taken up into the viewer's hands, which actually becomes then kind of the total inverse of Tina Segal saying, no photographs, for example. Not that I don't respect that gesture. Obviously, he does what he wants with his work, but yeah, that's interesting.
I think it's a good end. I don't know if other questions, thoughts, comments. Artie, do you have questions for to the future speakers of the program?
Questions for the future speakers?
I don't know. We're going to have Forrest Nash with us.
Oh, has he not spoken yet?
Yeah, will be at the end. Yeah. So maybe you can send me questions later.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe just see if he would be willing to acknowledge that he took part in the mirrors thing, because I think he really downplays that. I don't know if he used to make art. I don't know if he makes art anymore, or if he just is focusing on contemporary art daily. But I think it's like fascinating.
Ask about that.
He was part of that. Anyway, thank you so much.
Artie, thank you very much, and so thank you to everybody, and yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.